Don Crane and the 2nd Amphibious Tractor Battalion were among the very first Marines to strike Red Beach 2 at Teroa, taking part in one of the most dangerous and uncertain operations of the Pacific War. He carried himself like one of the island's legendary warriors, yet despite his courage and his role in history, his name does not appear in any official records or textbooks. This is the untold story of Don Crane, an American who went largely unnoticed by history, but who through grit and determination drove a first-wave LVT straight into the heart of the Teroa storm. He crossed the deadly coral reef and delivered Marines onto one of the bloodiest landing zones of the war, a place where so many fell under relentless Japanese fire. It was the moment his service reached its most dangerous and defining point. In October 1941, Don turned 17. Unlike most teenagers thinking of celebrations or planning their futures, he made a direct path to the Marine Corps recruiting office. His decision was deeply personal. He had 3 older brothers, all bigger and stronger than him, who for various reasons could not pass the Marine medical exam. At the time, the Marines controlled the number of men allowed to enlist through a quota system. For Montana, this meant only about a dozen could be accepted each month, and Don faced rejection 3 times in a row. He did not give up, however. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the quota restrictions were dropped, and America needed men urgently. Don's persistence finally paid off, and the birthday wish he had been holding on to became reality. In January 1942, he officially enlisted, joining thousands of other young men eager to serve. He soon found himself in San Diego for 6 grueling weeks of boot camp. The training transformed him from a farm boy into a Marine, instilling discipline, toughness, and a sense of belonging to something greater than himself. At the end of training, he was sworn in as a Marine, never imagining just how much suffering, loss, and sacrifice lay ahead of him on distant battlefields. By October 1942, Don was already being sent overseas. His assignment was with the 2nd Marine Division's Special Weapons Platoon, attached to B Battery 1. He boarded the transport ship President Monroe, part of a convoy heading toward New Zealand, where he and others would train and prepare for upcoming campaigns. Life aboard ship was monotonous, with little to do but drill and wait. Then, one day south of the equator, excitement surged as the men spotted ships on the horizon. At first they feared the Japanese Navy had found them. Tension grew until word came over the loudspeaker that what they were seeing was the rescue of Eddie Rickenbacker, the famous World War I ace. He had been forced to ditch his plane and endured 24 days adrift before being picked up. The Marines were amazed by his survival and lifted by the moment. For Don, it was another reminder that war was unpredictable and full of stories of endurance and courage. When the Monroe finally reached New Zealand, the Marines were warmly received by the local people, enjoying a brief period of hospitality before receiving new orders. The Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the 2nd Marine Division to prepare to seize the island of Teroa in 1943. Planning for this operation quickly revealed immense challenges. David Shoup, the division's operations officer, studied the situation carefully. The first major problem was the wide, shallow, fringing reef surrounding the island. Standard landing craft like the Higgins boat required deeper water, at least 3 feet, to safely reach shore, and at Teroa this was impossible. The second obstacle was even more daunting. Japanese defenses were concentrated, heavily fortified, and prepared to repel any assault. Shoup realized conventional tactics would fail and proposed a daring alternative. Instead of relying on Higgins boats, he suggested sending the Marines ashore in amphibious tractors, the LVTs. These machines had been designed only for hauling supplies, not for direct combat, and they were thin-skinned and underpowered. Still, they had tracks that could crawl over reefs and sand where boats would stall. It was a gamble that might change the course of the battle and ultimately the wider Pacific campaign. Don Crane's fate became tied to this bold plan. While the Marines continued training in New Zealand, Shoup ordered that men be assigned to crew the LVTs, which would be used in combat for the first time. In August 1943, Don was placed in the 2nd Amphibious Tractor Battalion. He had no experience with such vehicles, yet from the moment he first climbed into one of the 23-foot-long machines, weighing more than 20 tons and costing $35,000 each, He was intrigued. He later recalled how fascinated he was by the design and the way it moved. With little time to waste, he began rigorous training to become an LVT driver. He had to master handling the machine through water, over reefs, and under simulated fire. Within just a few months, he was fully trained, preparing to drive one of the first wave tractors in the assault on Teroa. Don understood that this role meant being at the very front, facing the heaviest fire. His vehicle would lead Marines across the reef and straight into the teeth of Japanese defenses. By late October, the assault transport Virgo was docked at Wellington, and Don's LVT, along with 9 others destined for the initial wave, were lifted onto its weather deck. The tractors were modified for combat. Each was armed with 3 machine guns, their cabs reinforced with additional steel plating, and large white identification panels were painted on the stern and sides so they could be recognized during the assault. As the men made these preparations, the sense of inevitability weighed on them. They were headed for one of the most dangerous landings of the war. The Virgo sailed to the New Hebrides, where the Marines practiced amphibious assaults for 2 days. During these drills, one of the LVTs malfunctioned and had to be taken out of action. Don lent a hand in getting it back aboard the Virgo, working with his crew to secure it. By November 13th, the Virgo was ready to depart, carrying Don Crane and his machine toward the battle that would define his service and put him face to face with the brutal reality of war in the Pacific. The Marines did not learn until the following day that Teroa would be their actual target. Before that moment, many of the young men on board had barely known anything about New Zealand, and even fewer had ever heard the name Teroa. 2 days before the landing, the officers gathered the men for a briefing. The captains and lieutenants assured everyone that the massive naval bombardment would wipe the enemy out completely. They spoke confidently, insisting that not a single Japanese defender would survive, and that if any did remain, they would be so broken that they would be crying for their mothers. The message was meant to build confidence and calm fears, portraying the assault as straightforward and almost easy. For Don, the orders were direct and simple. He was to carry 20 Marines from the 2nd Regiment to Red Beach 2 in his LVT and put them ashore in the very first wave of the attack. The situation he would face on that beach, however, was anything but simple. Intelligence reports described Red Beach 2 as heavily defended, a nightmare of obstacles and killing zones. The shoreline was lined with gun pits, cleverly hidden behind layers of concrete tetrahedrons. Barbed wire stretched across the reef to entangle men and vehicles. On the top of the stone seawall sat sandbagged firing positions, and behind them coconut log strong points provided protection for machine gunners and riflemen. Every inch of the place was fortified. Worse still, the defenders were not just ordinary soldiers. They were elite Japanese Imperial Marines from the 7th Special Naval Landing Force, men trained and sworn to fight to the death, and their instructions were to annihilate every American who set foot on the beach. Before dawn on November 20th, 1943, the assault transport Virgo lay in darkness off Teroa. Don remembered later how he prayed, how he tried to snatch a little rest, and how he ate steak and eggs as his last meal before combat. Soon LVT-41 was lifted over the side and dropped into the sea. Don took his place at the controls and guided her toward the rendezvous point in the open water. There, the Marines who had come in on Higgins' boats clambered aboard the amphibious tractors. The plan called for each LVT-1 to carry 18 assault troops, but Don's vehicle was crammed with 20 men pressed into the tiny cargo compartment like sardines. Riflemen stood jammed shoulder to shoulder, weighed down with full combat gear, their equipment clinking with every motion. The LVTs rode low in the water, their short freeboards causing waves to wash over, soaking the Marines before they had even faced a single shot. Once loaded, the tracked vehicles organized themselves into long columns. At precisely 6:48 in the morning, the first wave of 42 LVT-1s formed on the starboard side, while the second and third waves, composed of 2 lines of larger LVT-2s, moved to port. Don's LVT-41 found itself positioned just right of center in the first column, which by chance put him directly in the section of the beach that would prove to be the most deadly. At that moment, he had no idea that he was heading for the heart of the fiercest fire zone. As he steered forward, he had to battle both a strong headwind and the pull of the current to stay aligned with the Minesweeper Pursuit's guiding searchlight. The distance from the Virgo to the departure line was about 9 miles, the longest ship-to-shore journey attempted in any Pacific invasion, adding to the strain of anticipation. Don gripped the controls tightly, waiting for the storm he knew was coming. In those long hours of approach, he was unaware that the Japanese defenders were about to unleash the most concentrated torrent of fire the Marines had ever endured in the Pacific. Just before sunrise, the Navy began its promised bombardment. Battleships offshore let loose with 16-inch guns that hammered the island without pause. For more than 3 hours, massive shells crashed into the sand, exploding in roaring blasts that lit up the dawn sky and shook the sea. Don later remembered how the sound resembled freight trains screaming overhead. When the battleships finally paused, waves of carrier aircraft swooped in to drop bombs and rake the island with gunfire. Through the narrow view slit in the LVT's armor, Don caught his first glimpse of Battle, one of the small islands of Teroa, shrouded in smoke and fire. His spirits lifted for a moment as he saw the devastation and thought the Navy had truly kept its promise to pound the enemy into nothing. Battle looked like a funeral pyre, the earth itself burning and blackened. Still, he kept his Springfield M1 rifle within reach, ready for the worst. Behind him in the vehicle, Lieutenant Bonnie Little manned one of the 50-caliber machine guns fixed to the cab. Little had once written to his wife that in the Marines the greatest fear was not death itself, but the thought of failing to do one's duty. Don carried those words with him as the tropical breeze began to clear the smokescreen and reveal the island in sharper detail. A sudden chill went down his spine as the true danger became apparent. The island, far from destroyed, loomed menacing and defiant across the lagoon. Hidden from sight in pillboxes and bunkers, Japanese Marines lay in wait, their weapons trained on the advancing waves. At 6,000 yards offshore, the first column of LVTs turned right and crossed the line of departure, white wakes trailing behind them in the morning light. The voice of command came sharply over the radio, and Don heard the order to lock, knowing the moment of truth had arrived. Inside the LVT, every sound was sharpened by tension. Behind Don, the Marines packed into the cargo bay worked with quick, practiced movements, snapping safeties off and ramming 8-round clips into their rifles until the metallic clatter of bolts closing meant every weapon was ready. The smell of oil, sweat, and seawater filled the cramped space. Lieutenant Bonnie Little hunched over his heavy machine gun, drawing the cocking lever back and forth until the belt caught and the weapon was ready to spit fire. Every man aboard understood what was expected of him. They had to get ashore fast, strike hard, clear away whatever resistance survived the shelling, and hold the ground. Don's duty was equally clear but heavier in its weight. He was the one who had to carry them through, steer the ungainly machine across the deadly reef and onto the sand, and somehow deliver his human cargo alive. He pressed the Hercules engine with everything it had, straining to squeeze just over 3 knots from the lumbering machine as he lined up for Red Beach 2. He tried to angle left of the central pier, but the current grabbed at the hull and tugged him farther right no matter how tightly he fought the levers. For a brief stretch, there was only silence broken by the churn of tracks in water, the men holding their breath, triggers tight beneath their fingers, while the Japanese waited with the patience of predators. The naval guns and carrier planes had ceased firing to avoid hitting their own men, leaving the approach eerily unguarded. Then came the first enemy airbursts, splintering the surface of the lagoon as explosions rocked the Amtrak, and Don knew in an instant that the talk of an easy landing had been nothing more than wishful thinking. He tugged his helmet lower, stole a glance at the assistant driver on his right and the radio operator on his left, and realized they had reached the reef. The LVTs, designed to crawl where boats could not, clambered up onto coral and sand, proving the Japanese had miscalculated in their belief that the reef would halt the Americans. But the Americans had also overestimated the destruction wrought by the bombardment. The defenders, stunned for only a heartbeat by the appearance of the strange tracked vehicles, quickly recovered and hurled a storm of fire at them. For Don, it felt like being trapped in a carnival shooting gallery, only this was no game and every round was meant to kill. Without the covering fire of the fleet or aircraft to suppress the defenders, the Amtrak was exposed, scraping its way forward across the reef. Slowly, the tracks dug into sand and coral and the vehicle inched faster. The pier rose on the left, its length bristling with hidden guns. Shells punched holes through the side armor and ripped through the bow plating. To the right, the hulk of a stranded Japanese vessel came alive with flashing muzzles, pouring fire into the column. In moments, the assistant driver and the radio man slumped lifeless where they sat, their bodies struck by the incoming rounds. Don clenched the steering levers and dragged the vehicle toward the inlet that split Red Beaches 1 and 2. Ahead, though he did not yet know it, lay the most dangerous zone of all, the place already christened by the Marines as the Pocket, a section so heavily defended it would take 3 full days of brutal fighting to secure. And Don, without realizing, was driving straight into it. The armor of the LVT was never meant for such punishment. Months later in New Zealand, maintenance crews would test the plating and report that even a rifle round from an M1 Garand could pierce straight through. That grim truth had been kept from the crews for good reason. No one would have boarded otherwise. The cargo hold provided almost no protection for the Marines packed inside, and even the cab's thin shielding was useless against the kind of fire now slamming into them. Lieutenant Little held to his weapon until the end, dying in the very act of proving the words he had once written to his wife, that a Marine feared not death itself, but the shame of failing to do his duty. Don said afterward that he was too locked into his task of driving to notice all that was happening behind him, but he remembered the roar of Little's machine gun answering the storm until it fell silent. With 2 dead men on either side of him in the cab, Don kept his grip on the levers, forcing LVT-41 across the reef as the tractor staggered under the punishment of machine guns and near misses from 75mm weapons. Just when the reef was nearly behind them, the engine gave out abruptly, choking into silence. Don was so consumed with the struggle to reach the shore that at first he did not realize the men he carried were gone. Whether they had all been cut down at once or had fallen one by one as the Amtrak crept forward, he could not know. The truth hit only when he crawled out between the bodies of his dead crewmen in the cab and looked into the hold. The space that had moments earlier been crammed with 20 determined Marines was now a tomb. 18 motionless figures lying where they had fallen, rifles still clutched in their hands. The sight struck him harder than the pounding of any shell, the grim knowledge that he alone was left to bear witness. Only 3 of us came out of that tractor alive, myself, the rifleman, and the maintenance sergeant. And even then, both of them were badly wounded while I somehow escaped without a single injury. We had no weapons left between us, nothing to fight back with. So we simply hurled ourselves into the water and swam desperately toward the rear of the vehicle, clinging to life while the cargo hold behind us had been utterly obliterated. Every man and every piece of equipment inside had been destroyed beyond saving. History books later described the gamble of the LVTs at Teroa as a tactical victory, and that judgment is true. For out of the 42 amphibious tractors that made up the first assault wave, only 8 were destroyed before touching the sand. Don Crane understood with painful clarity what it meant to be aboard one of those unlucky 8. In his vehicle alone, there had been 23 Marines. In the end, only 3 survived, and he counted himself fortunate beyond measure to be one of them. He often said that divine protection must have been what spared him, because nothing else could explain his survival without even a scratch. There is a cruel irony in how events unfolded for Don, who had been part of shaping a new era of amphibious warfare in the 20th century, was forced to make landfall much like his Marine forebears had at Nassau back in 1776, plunging into the surf with nothing but grit and determination. Even so, he would not abandon the 2 wounded men who had survived with him. He nursed them through the long, terrible hours until darkness fell, and then led them to shelter behind a low seawall, refusing to let them die alone in the water. He pressed forward, joined the other Marines, and took part in the desperate battle that wrested the island from Japanese control. The clash lasted 76 hours and was one of the bloodiest fights of the war, reducing almost the entire Japanese garrison but also costing the Marines more lives than they could ever have imagined. Don later admitted that most of his memories of Teroa had blurred away with time. He said he could only recall perhaps 6 or 7% of the island and what happened on it, but the few memories that did remain haunted him for the rest of his life. The overpowering stench of the dead, a foul odor that lingered in the humid air, and the relentless noise of combat growing louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their boots, were things he could never forget. He remembered watching a fellow Marine struck in the throat by enemy fire collapse, gasping for air, and then witnessing a Navy corpsman calmly cut into the man's trachea and insert the casing of a thermometer to create an airway and save his life. Out of roughly 4,000 Japanese troops who had defended the island, only 17 were captured alive when the battle was over. On the American side, more than 1,000 Marines lay dead, and over 2,200 were wounded. The triumph was undeniable, but the cost was staggering. Red Beach 2 bore the brunt of some of the fiercest fighting, attacked by 3 Marine units that would record the highest casualty rates of the entire engagement. Dawn's own battalion of amphibious tractors lost half its men, and by the conclusion of the fighting, 90 of the 123 vehicles they had brought forward were destroyed or disabled. Of the 8 LVT-1s destroyed in that opening wave across the beaches, 6, including Dawn's LVT-41, went down in flames trying to reach Red Beach 2. 3 of the 4 Medals of Honor awarded for the entire battle were earned at that very stretch of sand by Lieutenant Colonel Shoup, Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, and Sergeant Bill Bourdillon. Testimony to the ferocity of the resistance and the valor of the men who pressed on regardless. Dawn would later describe Red Beach 2 as the bloodiest landing ground of the war. And he was right, for it exacted a toll unlike any other. The whole island stank for weeks, the smell of nearly 6,000 rotting bodies carrying miles out over the ocean so strongly that sailors approaching by ship could smell it long before they saw land. Dawn had expected to be back aboard the Virgo by the end of the first day, but instead he landed with only the clothes on his back. His combat uniform had been shredded and useless, so he searched for something clean to wear. It was then he stumbled upon the pack of Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman, which held a fresh pair of dungarees. Dawn didn't know who Bonnyman was at the time, only that he had died, and so he put on the clothes. Years later, he would attend a memorial service at Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu, where Bonnyman's name was spoken with reverence, honored as one of the bravest Marines of the battle. Dawn told Bonnyman's sister about wearing those clothes, and she replied that she was glad her brother had continued to help other Marines even in death. Bonnyman had been recognized for extraordinary valor in leading the assault that seized the massive sand-covered bomb-proof bunker behind Red Beach 3, an act for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Dawn remained on Teroa for 19 days after the fighting ended, helping recover wrecked LVTs and assisting with the unloading of Army garrison troops. Throughout that time, he wore Bonnyman's uniform, a practical disguise that also helped conceal the Marines' new tactical innovation from enemy intelligence. The role of the LVTs in the battle was deliberately kept from the press in the immediate aftermath, part of a broader strategy to guard operational secrets. After Teroa, Dawn's service continued with distinction. He made 14 shuttle runs to Tinian, was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions while operating an LVT-2 at Saipan, and even survived an explosion at Pearl Harbor while serving aboard an LST headed for Saipan. His family never forgot the sacrifice of those days. His uncle Bonnie Little had died at Teroa before Dawn was born, but the family always spoke of him with pride, knowing he had enlisted with honor and gone into battle fully aware of the risk he faced. He remains a hero to them, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The photograph of the LVT collection area that appears in records was taken by Dawn's own grandfather, Arthur John Strange of the 2nd Marine Division, though the official image is also preserved in the National Archives. Every man who fought at Teroa, in the eyes of those who came after, remains a hero, and Dawn often ended his recollections with the simple blessing, "God bless America." His uncle Alexander served with the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, fighting at Teroa, Saipan, and Tinian before he was killed in action on July 30th, 1944, during the battle for Tinian, which was declared secure only 2 days later. Dawn himself passed away many years later, and he is deeply missed. For me, finding pieces of his story in records and articles is always moving. Up until the day he died, he remained a patriot and a hero, and I will always be grateful for the good fortune of having heard his stories firsthand. They are memories I treasure, and I am thankful whenever